Hey guys, this is Kenjiro and welcome to another PaintShop Pro video. Today we're going to cover some more tips and information on using Photo Mirage Express. So a while back I created a video that just provided some general tips on using Photo Mirage Express when I first started using the application. More recently I've been working on another tutorial that uses Photo Mirage, and it made me realize that there were a few things that I didn't cover in that one and wanted to cover in this video. And to kind of demonstrate a lot of these things, we're going to be using our grid and this waterfall image to kind of show all the different pieces and pull it all together. So to get started, we're going to start off with this image of the grid, just because I feel like the grid makes it a lot easier to see how the different tools have an impact on the image geometrically. And one of the first things I wanted to cover was sort of the behavior around nodes. So if you're in the Photo Mirage interface and you have your image loaded and you were to click on this animation icon, you'll see we've got the arrows and we've got the nodes. So if we were to put a node just somewhere in the middle, and if we were to draw two arrows, one pointing at the node and one pointing away from the node, and then we hit play and we look and see what happens. And I think the takeaway here is that when you place a node, you're going to have two kinds of behaviors related to it. You're going to have compression, is what you can see. So when an arrow is pointing at the node, it's going to create a compressing motion. And conversely, when the arrow is pointing away from the node, it's going to have an expansion animation. And this is going to be kind of important when you think about how you're going to place your nodes in your image. That you want to think about, as the image is warping, how is it going to warp? Is there going to be a place where you would expect the motion to compress? And is there places where you'd expect the motion to expand? And in the cases where you kind of want things to flow past something and you don't really want expansion or compression, then you wouldn't really want a node, but instead, if we use our trash can tool and remove this node, but rather switch to the mask, and you want to make sure it's on plus, meaning we're going to add mask instead of subtract, and we just paint maybe in the same spot where our node was, and then we hit play, what you'll see is the behavior is different. Right now, you just have a continuous flow, and then you just have where we painted our mask, just this static image, almost as if it's floating over, whatever the background is. Although it's not really exactly what's happening, because, even the data that was behind here or is in this mask is really getting pulled here, even though it's not that obvious because it's a grid. But just keep those two elements in mind as we go into our waterfall image. So now we have our waterfall image loaded up, and I'll just hit play so we can kind of take a look and see at what the final view is, what it's going to look like when we're all done with what we're trying to do. So you can see water's coming down at least two channels, split by this rock that's kind of, in the middle, and then once it hits the water, it starts to expand out. So now if at first I kind of turn on the animation markers, right? So here's the arrows and the nodes that I created, or that I chose to use. And if we consider these points of compression and expansion like I described, we should be able to see that kind of come into play, right? So water's coming down, but then it splits here. So I would expect there to be a point of compression to hit here, and then expansion coming off of the sides of where this rock face is. You can add more, points of compression if there's like sort of a stair stepping of water hitting rocks, but if you don't want that, you could easily remove these nodes and it'd be a much more continuous flow. Now, more importantly, and most critical for this animation to kind of look correct, is we absolutely would have a point of compression and expansion right where this waterfall hits the water, right? So it comes down and then it would compress here, but then now it's expanding in sort of a different direction than where it was coming in. So now, having explained that, let's look at it again just to see, once again, hitting a point of compression and then splitting off and expanding, then hitting another point of compression here and then expanding outward. One other thing to note about arrows, which I may have mentioned before, is just what helps kind of sell the animation is if you kind of have the arrow lengths match perspective and distance, right? Farther things are going to move slower than things that are closer. So you can see that I've made the arrows shorter when it's further away and much longer as they get closer to where you as the observer would be standing. Now the one other part to cover is masking. So then what you'll see now that I've turned on the masks is that, I didn't obviously want all of the surrounding rocks and even this sort of splitting rock to be moved or affected by the animation. So very simply, just by painting in all the areas where you want it to be static, we mask it off, and then the whole thing just comes together. One last little bit that I'd like to mention about arrows and directions, and I can just demonstrate it in the water here. What you can see is all the arrows in most of the cases are kind of all flowing in a very similar direction. Like I don't have arrows, going backward or against the flow in these situations. What I've found is if you kind of have arrows going in a direction and you start exceeding the angle at which two arrows meet, and when I say exceeding the angle, I mean if you're exceeding 90 degrees, or greater, you're gonna find that it's gonna create these sort of straight line artifacts, right? Something that it's gonna look very unnatural. So my recommendation whenever you're kind of working in these kinds of images, if you're finding that you're having to make sharper angles, you may want to just make smaller ones and then create a more gradual flow. Otherwise, you're going to get those sharp lines showing up. Now, as a side note, let's say we had an image like this and we wanted to create an animation where the waterfall was flowing behind the subject and the subject was unaffected. So you'd still have that nice sort of waterfall animation, but then the static subject. Now, based on some of the things we talked about, you might do something like this, or you, at least conceptually, would say, okay, I've got arrows flowing through the water. I've got my compression point right where the water meets, the pool. And then I'd want to mask out my main subject so that that person becomes unchanged by the animation. Now, the problem we run into, however, is because of the fact that the animation, even when masking, is still going to pull from the data that exists here down. That's why you're seeing sort of this ghosting of the different parts of the subject's body flowing in the direction of the water. Now, this could be mitigated to some degree by adding nodes in very strategic places, along the bottom portions, just so that it tries to catch that data from flowing through. So you can see it starts to help out, but you really got to kind of, be really strategic about it, and you'd have to make sure that there are always enough arrows in between so that you're not encapsulating a region of like water, for example, between two nodes where there's no animation. Otherwise, it's going to be static along with it. But as you can see, since we discussed about compression and expansion, that when you start adding nodes, that it looks more like this is a point where the water is kind of coming off of his hand rather than flowing right past it. So then really what I would say at this stage, if this is something that you're really trying to do, you're probably better off just separating the subject from the background in PaintShop Pro, maybe using some cloning tools to make the waterfall consistent, like as if the subject weren't there, and then using Photo Mirage on just the waterfall and then overlaying the subject back onto the scene in your video editor. And in that way, you can produce something that looks much more clean like this. Anyway, that's it for this one. Just a few more extra tips on using Photo Mirage Express. And as always, if you have any questions or would like to suggest content, feel free to leave a comment. If you'd like to get updates of new content I create, click the subscribe button. And if you'd like to support me and the channel, check out my Patreon page, which is on the link on the screen. And I'll see you guys next time.